Hello, my name is Casimir. I am the manager for Macmillan in Italy. And I'd like to thank you all, first and foremost, for being here with us this afternoon. As you all know, we've got Stephen Taylor-Knowles with us. He needs little introduction, as he has long experience as a teacher trainer, and as an author. He's written a number of very successful courses for us, including Optimise. So without further ado, let me pass the mic over to Steve. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Casimir. Hello, everybody, and thank you very much for joining me. It's the end of the working day. I'm sure the majority of you have been at school all day teaching in one way or another. I'm an hour behind you. I'm in the northwest of England. I'm speaking to you from my office I live near Manchester, and it's turned a bit wintry here. I mean, for the first time we had a frost last night, so I had to start clearing frost off the car. But I love this time of year. Autumn is my favorite season. I want to talk to you today about optimizing your exam performance. As Casimir said, I've been involved as a writer in putting together a course called Optimise, which is aimed at teenagers preparing for exams. And so a lot of what I'm going to say today is in the context of work that I've done on that book, on that whole series, in fact. And in particular, I want to focus on what's happening at B1 level, because Cambridge Assessment English have just updated the B1 preliminary exam, and Optimise is aimed at the updated exam. And I think if we look at some of the aspects of how the exam has changed and how it has stayed the same, then I think we'll get at some interesting general principles about preparing students for different types of task and different exam skills. In particular, I think I'm probably going to have time to talk about reading and writing. So I'll be back some other time to talk to you about listening and speaking. But I think today there's a lot of ground to cover in reading and writing. I'll be talking for about 3/4 of an hour, and then we'll have a 15-minute Q&A session. So if anything occurs to you, if you've got any questions while I'm talking, then save them till the end, and I'll give you the chance to ask questions, and I'll try to respond to as many of them as I can. Now, let me just make sure, there we go. When my students are about to take an exam, I want them, or when they're preparing for an exam, I want them to bear two questions in mind, because I think these two questions are at the heart of how exams work and how they do well on exams. Exams are designed to test particular skills. So the first question I want my students to ask themselves, and the first question I want us to ask ourselves as teachers, is what are they trying to test? Exams don't just test English in some general sense. Each exam task is designed to test particular aspects of English. So what are the skills that they're trying to test? The second question I want students to ask themselves is, how can I give myself the best chance? What's the best way of doing this exam? So throughout everything that I'm saying today, I want you to bear those two ideas in mind. What are they trying to test? And how can I give myself the best chance? What kind of things do exams test? Well, the key language skills and functions commonly tested are things like your ability to scan, your ability to skim, your ability to justify your opinions, to give reasons. Different tasks test different exam skills. And depending on the particular task that you're doing, There are different techniques that you need to be good at in order to give yourself the best chance on that task. So with some tasks, it may be underline keywords, or with multiple choice questions, it might be cross off the incorrect answers if you're not sure, leaving yourself a smaller choice. These are the exam strategies. So all the time while we're preparing our students for exams, we need to be focusing on the skills they need and the strategies that they need. I'm going to be talking about B1 preliminary because that's just been updated. Starting from January 2020, coming January, the B1 preliminary has been updated. So I want to look at how it's been updated and talk about what kind of skills and strategies are important for the tasks as they exist from January 2020 onwards. So a little bit about terminology. The body that gives the exam now call themselves Cambridge Assessment English. They've gone through a few names, but now we are to refer to them as Cambridge Assessment English. And the exam is now called B1 Preliminary. You might know it as formerly PET, and A2 Key was formerly known as KET, and B2 First was formerly known as First Certificate, First, FCE, the lower exam. I mean, I used to teach in Greece, and people there still sometimes call it the lower exam, even though it hasn't been that since about 1975, I think. And some of the exams come in two versions. They come a main version and a 4 schools version. So there's B1 preliminary and there's B1 preliminary 4 schools. Just to give you a sense of the difference, at B2 First, there are 1 or 2 differences. For example, in the main B2 First exam, students may have to write a report, whereas in the B2 for schools, they don't have to write a report. B1 preliminary is the same in both versions. The difference is the kind of context and the kind of content that students are expected to deal with. You know, for years, Cambridge had the problem that they had exams like First Certificate. They had exams that were really designed for adults, but those exams were being taken by teenagers around the world. And in some cases, as I mentioned, I lived in Greece for a long time. In Greece, the age was getting younger and younger. Teenagers, 12, 13, were taking an exam that was designed for 20, 21-year-olds. So they brought out the 4 schools versions. That's the reason, really. And just a quick example of the difference is on the left, students are asked to write an email to their teacher who has asked them to come up with suggestions for games during a class party. So that's a school-based context. Whereas the second one on the right is about a friend coming to stay, and you're asking them, is there anything in particular you want to do? Have you got any questions? This is a much more for an older age group. So that's the kind of difference that we're looking at. The format of the whole exam has changed. Reading and writing used to be together, now everything's separated. Essentially, Cambridge Assessment English want to bring all their exams into line so that it's a smoother transition as you go from A2 Key to B1 preliminary to B2 First, so that the format and the experience of taking the exam is not exactly the same, but very similar. This is information that you can if you need it you can find, but this is what the whole exam looks like. 2 hours, 12 minutes writing and talking time divided across the 4 papers. As I said, today I think we're going to concentrate on reading and writing and leave listening and speaking for another time. In the old reading and writing paper, there were 3 task types that now aren't included. This is reading, decide if each statement is correct, incorrect. That's no longer on the exam. Sentence transformations are no longer on the exam. and the short communicative message, that's also no longer on the exam. Now, you may think that when students are preparing for a particular exam, if something is removed from the exam, then that should also be removed from their materials, from their class. I don't think it's as simple as that. Let's take the example of sentence transformations. What are sentence transformations and why? Why are they included in the B2 first exam? What's the point? And you know, I always feel with sentence transformations, out of all the use of English activities that we ask students to do, this is the most mathematical, the most like doing a crossword puzzle, the one that seems most removed from real life communication and use of English. However, I think that these are important skills. These transformations develop our students' understanding of lexicogrammar. This kind of manipulation of language reinforces different language structures. They're also very important for developing paraphrasing and rephrasing skills. Now, why are those important skills? They're important because they are key communication repair strategies. When communication breaks down between the learner and the person they're talking to, their interlocutor, it can be for one of two reasons. One is I said something that he or she didn't understand, or he or she said something that I didn't understand. And of course, the lower the level of English you go, the more likely that is as a cause of breakdown in communication. Now, this skill of paraphrasing and rephrasing is a key repair strategy. If I say something and somebody doesn't understand it, my first response may be to repeat myself, because perhaps the problem is they didn't hear me. That's the simplest repair strategy. But then if they still don't understand, I need to rephrase it. Sentence transformations practice that skill. It also practices me hearing different versions from another person. But probably the most important reason why I don't think we should remove this from our classroom just because the exam has changed is that this kind of task still appears on the B2 first exam. And I don't want my students walking into the B2 first preparation course on the first day, and that's the first time they've seen sentence transformation tasks. I need to prepare them and train them much more in advance than that. So in the updated version of Optimise that is aimed at B1 preliminary, we still have sentence transformation tasks, even though they don't appear on the exam, because they are still an important part of our students' training. The first task on B1 preliminary reading, part 1, looks like this. And this is almost exactly the same as it was before. Students are given 5 short texts of different types, and they're given 5 sets of statements, and they have to choose which statement is the correct statement for the respective text that they've been given. In the past, some of them actually started with a question with 3 answers rather than 3 statements, but it looks like that they don't really do that anymore. I mean, the skills being tested are the same, really, so it's not a big point, but I think that from now on they will look more like what this looks like on the page. Now, what is this kind of task testing? First of all, it's testing our students' understanding of different text types and the functions of different text types. As you can see on the right here, what we've got is a notice on a notice board. We've got a handwritten note. we've got a text message, an email, and a party invitation. So the first thing that this is testing is our students' understanding of what is going on, what are these messages, what type of messages are they? And then the second thing that is often tested, because these messages are transactional, they're usually about giving somebody information or asking somebody to do something. Then one of the key things also tested is students' ability to understand instructions. Now, how can I get my students closer towards thinking about the functions and the context of these messages? Well, what we've done in Optimise is we've given a kind of narrative thread that runs through the messages. Now, they don't do that in the exam, but this is not the exam. This is me training my students for the exam. So what we've got is, it's understanding text type, as I said, which involves looking at the design, thinking about what it could possibly be, knowing the different options, and also understanding instructions. So this involves getting our students to look for things like transactional language, like please, could you, or even more direct instructions like you should and imperatives. So what we've got here, we've created a kind of narrative thread running through the texts. The first one is a notice on a notice board saying that 2 furnished bedrooms are available for rent. Second, the handwritten message is from one girl, Natasha, to another, saying that she saw this notice, and the context, the implication is that they are looking for accommodation. Then we've got a text message. Hi, Adriana, when we saw the rooms, did you notice any bedroom lamps? I'm in the supermarket and can buy some if not. So these 2 girls are now planning furniture and fittings, the things they need for the flat they're going to share. Then Adriana sends an email to her mum saying she doesn't need some cooking things. And finally, they both send out a housewarming party because now they have moved into their apartment. So by creating a narrative thread that runs through the messages, it helps my students to think through the functions of those messages. It gives them a more meaningful context for what these messages are and why people send these kind of messages. Okay. This is 3-option multiple choice, this task. So that I just talked about the exam skills being tested. Let's just think about the exam strategies. What's the best way? How do you do multiple choice questions? This applies to reading, it applies to listening, it applies to all multiple choice questions. The key, perhaps the most important skill with multiple choice questions is recognizing when the same idea is expressed in 2 different ways. Because when you do a multiple choice listening, the words you hear are never exactly the same as the words in front of you on the page, because that would be trivial. They might be at a very low level, perhaps, I suppose, but generally they're not. They're the same idea expressed in 2 different ways. The same with reading. So the ability to spot keywords and phrases that mean the same thing in 2 different situations, that's absolutely key to doing multiple choice questions. So here I'm suggesting to students, read through the answers, underline the keywords, think of ways they could be written differently, and then read through the test to check. So here, for example, I want them to look at number 1. They might underline rent. Well, they probably wouldn't underline rent actually, because that's the same in all 3 statements. So what's different about each statement? Wash their own clothes, cook food, buy furniture. So wash clothes, cook food, buy furniture. Then I need to look through the text for something that connects to that. Laundry means wash clothes. Okay, so I want to guide my students through thinking through this process of spotting synonyms and different ways of expressing the same idea. B1 Preliminary Reading Part 2. Students are given 8 short texts and 5 people, and they need to match the correct person to the correct text. In this case, I've got descriptions of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 summer camps. And these summer camps all offer different experiences. There's a robotics camp, a business camp, a cooking, a culinary academy, a music camp, etc. And the students all have different interests, aims, abilities. Now, what is this task testing? How do you do this task? What you don't do is read person number 1 and then read all the text to find the right answer. Then read person number 2 and then read all the text. You haven't got time to do that. You need to scan. What is scanning and what is skimming? Okay, now I travel around a lot and I speak to teachers, and often when we talk about reading, this idea of scanning and skimming comes up. And the common answer I get is scanning is reading for specific information and skimming is reading for gist. That's almost right. But in fact, I'll tell you what scanning is. Scanning is a way of reading for specific information. So for example, imagine you're on a train station platform and you've got a printed timetable of all the trains. And I want to know the next train to London. Now, if you start reading at the beginning of that alphabetical list and you look at the trains to Aylesbury and you look at the trains to Banbury and you look at the trains to Cambridge and the trains to Derby, and eventually you get to the trains to London, you have read for specific information. You have found that specific information, but by that time the train has gone and I'm a little bit annoyed with you, okay? Because you didn't scan. Scan is not just reading for specific information, it's a way of reading. And in this kind of exam task, our students need to scan. But your students never scan, or they probably don't scan. And the reason is you ask them specific information questions, too much time to do it in. And so they just start at word 1, finish at word 500 and find the answer. How can we develop their scanning skills? Well, here's a couple of simple ways. A newspaper race in the classroom. So you take your class, divide them into 2 teams, and you bring to class 2 identical copies of the same newspaper. Okay, and you give one to one team and one to another. Newspapers are good because you can then separate the pages, and in each team, each student can have a different page if you like. And then you've got a set of quiz questions. So it might be, where did a robbery happen at 10 o'clock last night? Now they are forced to scan because they can't possibly start reading the newspaper at the first word. They need to think, okay, a robbery, news section, not the sports section. Scan the page to find the right article, then scan the article to the report to find where the robbery took place. The only way you can do that, task and take part in that newspaper race is by scanning. Another way that you can force your students to scan is to do ridiculous reading. Take a text that has some specific information in it, like some facts and figures or some names. Display it in front of all the students. Ask them a question like, who was successful in the end? And then display the text, maybe a few hundred words, display it for like 3 seconds, and then take it off. Now, they will complain because they may well start reading at the beginning, but the point is you need to give them limited time to do a specific information task. So then do it again, 3 more seconds. And now they will be looking in a different way. They will be scanning. And eventually somebody will find the right answer. And so this is a way of training them to read, because when it comes to these exam task types, they need that skill of scanning. In this particular case, if I go back to this particular exam task, what they need to do is read each person. Let's say read the first person, figure out what the key information is. Like it's a bit small for me to read here, but maybe he likes performing and he likes writing. Okay, so now I need to scan the texts to find mentions of performing and writing. Scanning is a way of reading, not just reading for specific information. Reading part 3. This hasn't changed. It's a text with 4 option multiple choice questions. It's the same as old part 4, but it's become part 3. Okay. In this case, we've got a text about forensic artists. Okay, so these are people who recreate the faces of missing people or draw images of suspected criminals, that kind of thing. So, and then students have to answer multiple choice questions on those texts. Now, again, multiple choice questions are about identifying synonyms. Find different ways of expressing the same idea. Multiple choice questions always work like that. I've worked as an examiner and I've written lots of books. I've written lots and lots of multiple choice questions. And they all work in the same way. They all work around synonyms, expressing something in one way in the question and expressing it in a slightly different way in the listening text or in the reading text. So that's what I need to get my students attuned to. And here they need to skim. Now again, skimming is a way of reading for gist. How do you skim? You read very quickly, skipping words, particularly skipping words that you don't understand, but forget it, you don't need it. Just read the whole thing, tell me what it's about. Again, it's about a limited time, but in this case, you know, scanning and skimming are really about the purpose for reading. In this case, I want to find out what the writer is trying to do. When it comes to scanning, that's about me and my purpose. You know, I don't care about anything else. I'm looking for a particular piece of information. How are we going to get our students to skim? Well, a simple way is to work with a top level of gist, get them to read the texts for gist, to get them to skim the texts and decide, is this a correct summary of the gist of that paragraph or not, or the gist of those few sentences? That's what's going on here. Part 4 is new to B1 preliminary, but it exists in B2 first. It's a gapped text. Students are given a text, 5 sentences have been removed, and they've got 8 sentences, and they have to decide which sentence goes back in which gap. Okay. Here's the text. This is about the Hyperloop. This is one of the projects of Elon Musk. It's like an underground, really fast means of transport along kind of special tunnels. Sentences have been removed. Here are the sentences, and the student needs to decide which sentence goes back in which gap. Now, what does this task test? It tests students' understanding of coherence and cohesion. You probably know those terms, but let me just very briefly outline what I mean by coherence and cohesion. Well-written texts make sense. They go from one idea to the next, then an example, then a counter-argument, then a reason why that counter-argument isn't true, then a conclusion. Or if it's a story, they go from one event through another, maybe they then flash back to something earlier, but essentially there is a coherent flow of ideas through a text. That's coherence. At the same time, texts are held together by language. I saw John. He told me about the party. He is John. The pronoun refers to something from the previous sentence. Texts are held together by language. That's cohesion. And this kind of task is designed to test students' understanding of coherence and cohesion. Do they understand what idea is being talked about at this point? And also, do they understand how the words in the sentences and in the texts are linked, how they hold together? So we need to do lots of work with our students understanding linking words and phrases such as, for example, in other words, etc. They need to know what the functions of these are and how to use them and how other people use them. So they should always come to it with, as it says at the end there, if a sentence starts with instead, you should always ask yourself, instead of what? That's the function of the word instead. So the more students understand these cohesive devices, the better they will perform on this kind of exam task. A key way in which texts create coherence is through the use of tenses. Okay. As particularly certain types of text, descriptive texts or stories, the tenses order events. So with this kind of text, sometimes with this kind of task, students need to understand the order of events so that they know which sentence goes in the correct gap. And so then a little bit of exam technique that they need is once they've put the sentences back in, they need to read around the gap to check that it makes sense. That's the tip I'm giving them here. They don't necessarily need to read the whole text. If they've got time, then yes. But if not, then at least read the sentence before the sentence you've chosen and the sentence after. Does it make sense? Part 5 of reading. This is the multiple choice close. It's the same as the old part 5, but shorter. This tests understanding of collocation. So I want my students to look at the words on both sides of the gap. Is it part of a phrase? Try saying the whole phrase with each word in. Which one sounds most natural to you? But also, this is a key test of lexical accuracy. You know, mostly when students are reading and they come across words that they don't already know, and we ask them, work it out from the context. In that kind of situation, I'm usually happy if they can work out that it's a positive idea or a negative idea, because texts usually are very poor context for working out the meaning of words. They're not written for that purpose. They don't work like that very often. But in this case, this is a test of lexical accuracy. My students need to know the subtle or sometimes not so subtle differences between the words that are being chosen, chosen between. Reading part 6. This is the open close task. What does this test? Okay. This kind of task can only test a fairly limited set of vocabulary, a set of language. It can test grammar, it can test relative pronouns, it can test conjunctions, it can test prepositions, it can test auxiliary verbs, it can test phrasal verbs. So students need to know that it's about grammar. It's not always about grammar, but it usually tests grammar. So think about verb tenses, verb patterns. By verb patterns, I mean the kind of Verb patterns is my student-friendly word for what is sometimes called colligation or lexicogramma. So with the verb succeed, for example, we say succeed in ing. That's I want to call that a verb pattern. And in this kind of task, they might test in, for example. Auxiliary verbs. This is very common in this kind of test, particularly using the passive voice. They use the passive voice and miss out the word been, for example. It has been destroyed, and they'll miss out the word been. Very common. Phrasal verbs. Let's say a word about phrasal verbs. This kind of task can test phrasal verbs. So when students look at the gap, is there a particle immediately after the gap? Does it say blank up? In which case, it could be a phrasal verb, take up, give up, look up. Or is there a verb followed by a gap, take blank? That could also be a phrasal verb, take off, take up, take in, take over. What do I want students to know about phrasal verbs? Sometimes I think students feel as if phrasal verbs are random. And I think sometimes that's because of how we present phrasal verbs to students. So, for example, take up a hobby. Why is it take up? It just is. Get over an illness. Why is it get over? It just is. The fact is that there is an underlying logic to phrasal verbs. That's what I'm trying to get at here with this information box. Remember, if you aren't sure which particle to use in phrasal verbs, particles aren't random. Some, maybe a couple of years ago, there's a TV series. I don't know if you have it in Italy. It was called. You obviously have to read competition shows. This one was called The Great British Bake Off, and it's really really popular here. And you know, the Regency in Britain was the period at the start of the 19th century. King George IV went mad, and so his son became Prince Regent, reigning while he was, and so that period is referred to as the Regency. And the task that they were given, the task that the contestants were given, was to prepare some food in the style of that era, and they all wore Regency clothes. And one of the contestants said, "We're going to Regency it up." Right? We're going to Regency it up. Now, you can look in all the phrasal verb dictionaries you like, and you will not find the phrasal verb to Regency something up. But how did I know immediately, and how do you know immediately what he means? Because he's made up a phrasal verb, Regency something up, and we know that one of the metaphorical meanings of up is increase, put up prices, okay? Grow up. The key to understanding phrasal verbs is through the metaphorical uses of the metaphorical meanings of the particles. Okay, so I want my students to get some of that understanding, so that even if they don't know this phrasal verb, it might say, it gets me blank. Now, because my students know that phrasal verbs that are negative often use down, or phrasal verbs with down often have a negative meaning, then maybe, even if they've never heard that phrasal verb, maybe they can take an educated guess and suggest gets me down, which of course would be the correct answer. Here's a task designed to work with that reading part, so getting at the use of auxiliaries. So in each sentence, an auxiliary verb is missing. They have to decide where. So we had swimming for a while. Of course, it should be we had been swimming for a while. Again, working with auxiliaries. Have you ever been somewhere and been surprised by the amount of pollution? In this case, They're not just empty sentences. I actually want my students to complete the sentences and then ask and answer the questions. Okay, so that's what I had to say about reading. I've got maybe another 5 minutes. I'm gonna, let me say one or two things quickly about writing. In part one of writing, students are given an email with notes. Now, the more you think about it, that's a bit of a strange thing, isn't it? An email that you have written notes on. I'm not even sure what that is, but it's a kind of clumsy way, I suppose, of giving students prompts. But if you think about the real, it doesn't make any sense, really. Now, I want my students to work through analyzing tasks, analyzing model answers, looking at key functions, like in this case, making suggestions. Then I want to guide them step by step by producing their own piece of writing. Okay. And notice at the end there, what I'd like to give all my students when they do a piece of writing, I want them to complete a checklist. Why did I start to include these? When you've got a class of 30 students, I always find it very frustrating that with a class of 30 students, you ask them to write an informal email. 2 of them will write a story. 3 of them will write a full email. So, and there's no point, if we're focusing on emails and you've written the completely wrong text type, there's no point me even marking it or looking at it. So this is like, this checklist says, this is the minimum that I expect before I will even look at your piece of writing. Have you written an informal email? Yes, good, because that's what we talked about in class. Have you followed your paragraph plan? Yes, good. So this is a way of creating a little bit of a filter so that when I get the composition from my student, I've at least said, come on, this is the minimum that you need to do. Make sure it's the right text type, check your spelling. So I think those checklists, I found them quite useful. In one of the things we include in Optimise is these examples of texts with these useful tips connected to the text. This is an email where we give our students various bits of advice about the various bits of email. In the final couple of minutes, I want to think about this. In part 2, students have to write either an article or a story, right? What advice on writing articles do you give to your students? Single most effective bit of advice, I think, that you need to constantly remind your students of is this. An article is not an essay. They are 2 distinct types of writing, and I'm not sure that we as teachers always make clear how articles should differ from each other. An essay is a formal, discursive piece of writing that presents an opinion or a case and maybe the arguments for or against or advantages and disadvantages. An article is a fun piece of, usually, a fairly fun, light-hearted, conversational piece of writing that appears in a magazine. It's not an essay. So here's this task again. Articles wanted. Write an article telling us what you find funny and who you enjoyed laughing with. I don't want my students to start writing something like, to begin with, I would like to explain that laughing is very important nowadays. In particular, they're writing an essay. What is a good way of starting an article to make sure that your students start off on the right foot with the right tone? Use a rhetorical question. So, I want them to use the right style, and a good way of doing that is start with a rhetorical question. For example, here's the article, How to Plan the Perfect Holiday. Have you ever had a terrible holiday? If I start with a question like that, the reader about his or her experience or his or her opinions, I can't then write an essay. This is a very good way of getting the tone of an article right. And there's an example of a story with these advice tips around it. Okay, thank you so much for listening to me. That's about 45 minutes, isn't it? Do you have any questions? Now is the time to ask me any questions. I'm just going to turn off stop sharing my screen. Excuse me while I technical things here. Okay, so I'll just wait for 30 seconds for anybody to start typing in any questions in the question box. You know, this platform is an interesting platform. Every time I've done webinars before, I've been able to communicate with people through the chat box, but I don't think that's possible here. So I'm not even sure that you're there, actually. I'm sure you are there. I'm sure I would have been told if I was disconnected. So okay, here's a good question. How do I get shy students to talk in class? Okay, that's a very good question and a very common problem. The first thing is that I think different students benefit from different approaches. Some students want personalization. They want to talk about themselves, their own opinions, their own lives, their own ambitions, their own experiences. Other students don't. So if you've got students who seem shy in class, then one approach to take is to ask more abstract questions. Don't ask questions that start with, what do you think about? Or what's your opinion of? Ask questions that start with, what are the reasons for? Or what are the results of? So that it's not about me and my opinions, but is about something more abstract. That takes the pressure off me having to talk about me, which I think is often the problem with students who appear shy in class. The second thing I think that makes students shy in class sometimes is our reaction to mistakes. I think we need to be very clear on when the focus is on accuracy and when the focus is on communication. It should never happen. It should really not happen that you ask a student to express their opinion, they express it, and then you start correcting the language they've used. That moment is not the right moment, because that confuses communication with correction. When you are trying to get students to communicate, I think one thing that's very good to do is to make a note of any problems, particularly any problems that more than one student have. You know, if you're in open class, if you're asking questions and a couple of students make a mistake with the passive voice, it's worth making a note of that, and then a little later doing a quick review of the passive voice. So I think with shy students, sometimes it's our attitude to correction that can make a difference. And finally, I think I would say on that with shy students, sometimes it's not a problem. Sometimes students are just figuring things out in their own mind. Now, I think that learning a foreign language is taking on a new personality. It is changing your character, and things like confidence, things like social skills do make a big difference to your use of language. But everybody needs to come to that in their own time and at their own pace. So I guess I would say also about students who appear to be shy is don't force it, create the circumstances where they can feel comfortable talking maybe about more abstract topics, and I think you can get somewhere with them that way. Okay, one more question. Should I get students to correct each other's work? Have you ever tried peer correction? Okay. You get students to read each other's writing, it's usually done with writing. You get students to read each other's writing and to somehow respond or correct. Now, I want to draw a distinction between peer correction and peer response. I think peer correction is generally not a good idea. I think it can lead to tensions between students. It can lead to arguments. It can lead to resentment. Who's this person doing my written work when I don't mind the teacher doing it, but I don't want Dimitri doing it. And they're not qualified. They don't really have they are still on that journey of learning English. They are not qualified to correct. However, there is a big thing that they can do. Does the piece of writing achieve its aim? So if, for example, a piece of writing is a story, what's the aim of a story? Well, the aim of a story is to entertain, to surprise, to interest. Does it do that? Now, they are perfectly qualified to comment on whether a piece of writing achieves its aim because they are a reader. What's the aim of an essay? The aim of an essay is to clearly present a point of view in a formal way. Okay. Does this piece of writing present the opinion clearly? Is it well argued? Can you follow the argument? They are perfectly placed to respond in that kind of way. Okay. So I would say it's great for students to read each other's writing. I would steer clear of peer correction, and I think it's better to go in the direction of peer response. Okay, I think I'm just about done for today. Is somebody going to come back in and take over? Because I think, thank you so much for sticking around at the end of your working day. Well, maybe you've got home, maybe you're sitting by the fire, watching me on your laptop, but thank you. I hope to be out in Italy sometime soon and to meet more of you face to face, and maybe meet some of you again who I've met on my previous trips to Italy. But otherwise, thank you very much for listening. And if you've got any further questions about my course, then the people at Macmillan in Italy are the people to speak to. So otherwise, thank you. And I'm going to hand back over to Casimir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. So I just want to wish everyone a good afternoon. We will be doing more webinars in the near future on a number of different issues, including writing and reading and so on. But in the meantime, just keep watching for our webinars, and we'll be sending that information around in the near future. Thanks again, and have a great afternoon.